Greetings from Bell, Missouri. I'm at the Osage Arts Community, Artist Residency and Farm, and today I'm going to present to you about a Route 66 ghost town in Illinois by the name of Thomasville. Here we see it on this 1931 map, along with other Route 66 towns we hear about quite a bit. Glenarm, DeVernon, Farmersville, Wagoner. Thomasville may be found on other maps from the Route 66 era, such as this one from 1945. Notice that Green Ridge, another Route 66 ghost town, is listed on this map off to the southwest. I have a separate video about Green Ridge. Check that one out. Thomasville, and Green Ridge for that matter, may be found on this 1948 map from McNally, or this one from 1956. Thomasville and the buildings still standing are depicted in this 1979 topographic map. But Thomasville never became a part of the Route 66 discourse. There are no real mentions on websites or guides or anything like this, and I have a few reasons for that. In fact, while you're driving down Route 66, the only real indication that you're in or near Thomasville is this little sign saying Thomasville Trail, the name of the road that leads to it. Researching the history of Thomasville has proved to be extremely difficult. According to postahistory.com, there was a post office that opened there in 1889, so I looked at a map from that year, and sure enough, we see Thomasville. This map also depicts the Route 66 ghost town of Zanesville. I have a separate video about that one. Check that out. What's interesting, though, is that this has yet a third location of Zanesville, one that I hadn't seen before. I found Thomasville listed on this 1897 railway guide, so there would have been a station, or at least a stop, at that time. This map from 1901 shows Thomasville, and the circles indicate that there is banking. So notice that Thomasville does not have a bank at this time, perhaps never did have a bank, I don't know. Finding any information on what Thomasville did have was very difficult. I did find this 1919 ad in the Shorthorn World advertising the auction of cattle. But it didn't actually end up happening there. They had to move it to Verdon, according to the next issue in the same publication. This wouldn't be the last time Verdon has taken attention away from Thomasville. So it's quite possible these sorts of activities, such as loading and unloading cattle or auctioning them off, would have taken place in Thomasville. And then I found reference to Thomasville in a 1921 issue of Reliable Poultry Journal. Such a riveting read. You know, I always look forward to the next issue of RPJ to come in the mail. So you see there J.H. Hart of Thomasville, Illinois, advertising in this journal. This map here is from 1925, and there's a nearly identical one from 1923. So just a few years after those references to cattle and poultry in those journals, and only 1 year before Route 66 was designated, and 5 years before Route 66 actually came through this part. Like other Route 66 towns in this part of Illinois, Thomasville is centered around the railroad a half-mile west of 66. This map depicts a couple of buildings along the railroad, 3 buildings along the north-south road that parallels it. Today it's called Thomasville Trail or County Road 22. And then 3 additional buildings set back from it along 2 east-west cross streets. It seems that Thomasville was a small community in the 1920s. I took this photo last summer, and what I've done here is I've annotated the 6 buildings on the east side of that north-south road to show approximately how this town was laid out. The big question that I have is what happened to Thomasville after 1925 and into the Route 66 era. And this postal map from 1952 shows that the post office was still operating some 63 years after it began. And this postal map from 1954 shows Thomasville's post office was closed. Notice the triangle. Now, just because a post office closes doesn't mean a town becomes a ghost town. There are plenty of reasons why a post office may close. You'll see Farmersville is very close. Transportation has improved by the 1950s. This map is from 1956, and so is this aerial photograph. You see Thomasville centered around the railroad tracks off to the west, a couple buildings along the east-west road, and then a building along Route 66. And you can see at the junction of 66 and the road into Thomasville, there isn't much there. This is one of the reasons why I think Thomasville never really became a part of the Route 66 discourse. But that's only looking at the immediate area around Thomasville. So let's zoom out and have a larger view. I've drawn in Route 66, the roads into Thomasville, and a crossroad. Looking at the area by the crossroad as it was in 1924, we see a couple of important structures, a church and a school. I've yet to find out when the school closed, but I did find in the April 21st, 1941 edition of the Decatur Daily Review that a Miss Ruth Fox of Verdon was hired at this school. Verdon is located 7 miles to the west via this crossroad. I include this information because Jack Rittenhouse, in his 1946 Guide to U.S. Highway 66, mentions this junction at the road to Verdon, where there's a gas station and grocery with 3 cabins, and then he mentions another gas station, cafe, and 8 cabins a few hundred yards north. And even though the town is labeled on maps at the time, Rittenhouse doesn't even have an entry for Thomasville, so it doesn't appear that there were any roadside businesses there. Thus, in the 1940s, the bulk of the activity in the vicinity of Thomasville was actually a mile to the north at the junction of the road to Verdon. There were 2 gas stations, a cafe, lodging, a school, and assuming it was still there 20 years later, a church as well. These photos are from 1956, so 10 years after the Rittenhouse book. It's very possible that the church, the school, and the buildings he mentioned were demolished for the widening of Route 66 to the 4-lane we see here. This is another reason I believe Thomasville never became considered a Route 66 town, even though it was right there along the highway. Here is the area a few hundred yards north that Rittenhouse described. There's nothing there in 1956. All of the towns along Route 66 in this part of Illinois are centered around the railroad a half mile to the west. Yet, Rittenhouse still has an entry for DeVernon, Farmersville, and Wagoner, and he does mention that they are centered a half mile to the west. There is no mention of Thomasville, but there actually is an entry for Verdon, even though it's 7 miles to the west. And it's that junction with the road to Verdon located a mile north of Thomasville with all the activity. So, like the cattle auction that got moved to Verdon, we have another case of the larger city of Verdon overshadowing Thomasville. And that should come as no surprise, because according to this guide from the Illinois Central Line, the population of Thomasville in 1944 was only 29. So, with the widening of Route 66, it's probably a good thing that the original center of Thomasville never embraced Route 66, as those buildings didn't have to be removed. And with the coming of the interstate, not having an exit would probably kill the town if it had relied on highway traffic. What seemed to keep the place name alive in the 1950s was the Thomasville Grain Company. Even though the post office closed, they still used the name Thomasville in their company name and for their location, but their phone number was listed as being in nearby Farmersville. I found this picture of a thermometer advertising the Thomasville Grain Company, but with a Farmersville zip code at the bottom. So when exactly did Thomasville become a ghost town? Well, that's impossible to determine based on varying definitions of a ghost town. Between 1925 and 1956, several of the buildings around the original center of town are gone or replaced, and only one of the 2 short east-west cross streets in that small district remain, and it appears to be merely a driveway. By 1971, we see buildings disappear along the east-west road, but other ones to the southwest are added. But by the Thomasville Grain Company, we see thriving activity, so it may have turned from residential to commercial. So perhaps we can say by the 1970s, Thomasville became a ghost town, as there are even less people living there, even though there is a thriving business. Over these years, you can see buildings begin to disappear. For instance, in the original part of town, the building in the southwest part of that district is seen until 2005, when it becomes hidden among the trees. Here's what that looks like today, so I'll have to go back during the winter sometime to see if there's actually a building still back there. So that whole area in the last decade has become just one building at a clump of trees with maybe a building hidden within it. And in even more recent years, that building is gone, so I had to go to Google Street View to see what was there. Compare 2013 to 8 years later, which was when I came to do field research. There's nothing left of the original town site on this side of the road, except maybe something hidden among the trees. I've annotated this photo with approximate locations of the buildings as depicted in that 1925 topographic map. Quite the difference, I'd say. And here's looking at Thomasville from Route 66, and I've annotated this photo to show where some of these buildings used to be. 1930 is when Route 66 first came through here, so let's summarize Thomasville becoming a ghost town using this circa 1930 map, where we can see the school and the church, where later there were also gas stations, a cafe, and lodging. And we see the center of Thomasville. Notice the shaded in area. This is where those cross streets were and several buildings. And yet today, what was that shaded in area is now just some cargo and a clump of trees, a distant memory for the few that once called Thomasville home. Our friend Lily over here has become very curious as soon as I started recording, so everyone say hi to Lily. I hope you enjoyed this video on Thomasville, and I hope to see you out on the road. From Osage Arts Community, have a good one.